and welcome to this video. And this is the part one of a two-part series. And this video is going to be called Why Prog is Good. And then part two is probably going to be called Why Prog is Crap. Okay? Now, why have I decided to do this? Well, to start off with, when I look at the analytics for my channel, without a doubt, the videos that do the best are the videos that have prog in the title, right? And so every week I think I somehow need to put prog in the title of at least one video, because all you prog fans will click and watch me talk about prog. That seems to be the most popular thing that I have to offer to the internet watching, YouTube watching audience, is me talking about progressive rock. Okay, I love progressive rock. It's a part of my DNA. You know, I grew up listening to progressive rock, and I'm a big fan of progressive rock. I think the edge I have is the fact that unlike heavy metal and jazz fusion, which are the other two styles I tend to talk about, and jazz, I have recorded in a ton of progressive rock bands. So I'm going, for those of you who don't know, I was the drummer for about 4 or 5 years of the neo-prog band IQ. I was a founder member of the progressive rock band Frost, recording on the first 2 albums, and I'm on the 3rd album as well. I've also done session work with members of Pendragon. I've played with the guys from Palace. I've played with the guys from Arena, and I've got a lot of links, especially in the neo-prog world. I have played drums with the progressive rock band Magenta. With Rob Reed, who's a keyboardist of Magenta, I formed a progressive rock band Kiyama, and a few years ago I formed my own progressive rock band called Rain. We are signed to GP Records. A few years back we brought an album out called Singularity, and we are just about to finish off our 2nd album, and I'm not going to tell you what that's called yet because it's all top secret. This 2nd album I am really pleased with. All the stuff I talk about on this channel that makes prog good, I have tried my best within the band, and we've all tried to make an album which is a true progressive rock album that does all the things we love, that makes progressive rock the best genre. I love progressive rock. You are watching it probably love progressive rock. But progressive rock culturally is not seen as being good, right? It's the story that is around progressive rock. If it's ever mentioned in the mainstream press, as soon as they mention it, they are going to start using words like overblown and pretentious, and that punk came along and set everything straight, and you're going to get the story of, yes, you know, making Tells of Topographic Oceans and having the fake cow there and the straw bales, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer with the 3 lorries with their names on that nobody could read on the top. You're going to get that. That is the thing around progressive rock. So when progressive rock gets spoken about, there's a little bit of a yes, yeah. Is it that comes from the intelligentsia? Oh, you know, these silly people with their liking of progressive rock. We know the truth. You know, it's a bit tasteless, a bit pretentious. You know, that thing exists. So I think it's very important, because I don't think this is the case at all. I believe that the greatest progressive rock albums are some of the greatest musical achievements in contemporary music history, in rock history, pop music history, right? I really believe that's the case. And I think it's worth making a video where I try and create an argument here and really consolidate some ideas, which I'm going to try and do in a minute, of why I think progressive rock is such an incredible genre and why it needs to be valued, and why the best of it is amongst the best music ever made, and it should not have that smirky know-all looking down at their intelligent nose aspect that so many music critics have brought to this genre. That shouldn't happen. And on this video I'm going to argue why that shouldn't happen. So on this video, this is about why progressive rock is great. And I'm going to balance that with a video from someone who has worked in this genre of all the stuff that has perturbed me about progressive rock as a genre. Right, that's going to be in another video, but there's a whole ton of stuff. To the point where I actually, in the late 2000s, I sort of walked away from IQ and Frost. You know, that now there's personal reason by that, but there was also the fact that I'd become very, very frustrated with the genre. Okay, and that's the story I will tell on part 2. But on part 1 today, I'm going to explain why I think progressive rock is great. Okay, so we have to start with what my definition of what art and music is, and then we have to extrapolate that onto what I think makes art and music good, and I'm going to try and do that very quickly and succinctly. If you want to know more, there's videos on this channel where I explore that more. I think that art has a role for humanity, and that role is the balance of perfectionism and hedonism. There's an emotional aspect of art that makes us feel a certain way, and there's a perfectionism aspect of art which is about everything being in the right place at the right time and nailed and conforming. And those two aesthetic things are things that we appreciate. It's the aesthetic appreciation of the world around us. And in that appreciation, there is an inherent contradiction and dichotomy, because human beings are not able to balance hedonism, emotionalism, with this sort of perfectionism or nailedness. I think that's a split that we have. It's embodied on a progressive rock album, on the album Hemispheres by Rush. It's embodied there. It's the Dionysian versus Apollo. You know, it's the head and the heart. Those are two things that human beings have a great difficulty in balancing, and art does this, right? Great art does this in a way which is relevant and important to the culture that art is created in. So in other words, our balancing of those two things has to shift as culture shifts, and for it to shift, art has to shift with it, and it has to show us the way. And so the balance, the type of balance and the way those two things are balanced has to change. My argument is fundamentally that progressive rock balanced that at a certain time in history, which was very important. But also, there's a sublime aspect to the way those things are balanced. When they're balanced absolutely correctly, it goes through history, you know, where you can look back on great pieces of art and see the balance of those two things. We can see it in Mona Lisa's smile. We can see it in the pyramids at Giza. We could see these two things in perfect balance. So there's a cultural aspects within the time frame of that art exists in, and then there's the long-term sort of absolute, you know, infant aspect of art. That's really important. And the fact that you have a snapshot in time, and then you have the whole history of time, the instant against infinity, the finite point against infinity, that those two things actually point to this balance. It's in there in that statement. See, we have a problem with this, and every time you speak about it, where does this come from? It comes from the way we've evolved. It's come from the way our senses work. We don't see the universe as it actually is. Nobody can. We see it through the lens of our evolved existence on the planet. And that is twofold. One of those is the pleasure-seeking, reaching out. Right? That's the hedonism. The pleasure-seeking motivation to reach out and grab that berry. Right? To walk over that horizon, to see that vista. That's a part of humanity which is so important and has made human beings what they are. But when you reach out, you risk your demise. With every single reach, you have to check. And that checking, that seeing how it fits in, is perfectionism. It's the grid. It's order. It is chaos and order. Every time you reach out for that hedonistic grasp into the unknown, that's chaos you are reaching out to. That thing you grab, you pull out, and then it is ordered. It is classified. You know, human beings would have reached out for that berry, and they would have eaten it. And the brave ones would have reached out. The ones that were more pleasure-seeking would have reached out. And the ones who bit the berry that poisoned them and they dropped down dead. Then the other part of humanity would go, don't eat those berries. Lock it to the grid now, right? These ideas develop. You know, the idea of perfectionism really comes from the Greeks. It really comes from Plato. Perfectionism is a nonsense. There's no such thing as perfectionism. It's a human invention. But we don't feel like there is because of Plato. We feel there's a Platonic realm. We feel like there's perfect forms. All artists feel like they're trying to sculpt something that fits into that Platonic form, that relates to it in some way, right? But it's not. It's not about that. It's the balance of that grid. I call it the grid, but it's the balance of things being in the right place, right, against the pleasure. This is why if you go on a roller coaster and you experience just pure pleasure, right, or someone massages you, you experience pleasure, that's not art, right? And a load of perfectly drawn lines on a piece of paper which are exactly a centimetre apart is not art. It's the balance of those two things which creates the art. That is what I believe art is. These two things for me relate to time and space. Space is about being in the moment. When you see things spatially, you're in the moment. We're in there and you're looking out. This is the world around us. Space in the moment at that time. Time is the awareness that there is a past and a future and that we're on a line travelling along that. And that line is the grid. Music has two aspects to it. Music has a spatial aspect, which is to do with pitch. It's to do with things being high and to being low, and also things being close to you and far away. Those are the two spatial dimensions of music, and that is embodied in music very powerfufully. But also, music, unlike painting and to some extent books, is entirely time-based. There is the aspect of time in paintings and books, but in music it is very apparent, and that is the grid. You know, anyone who's worked on a computer, which gives you the ability to sculpt your music into the doom of perfection. You can take every little bit of emotionalism out of it now with a computer and be left with nothing, and that for me is the problem with so much modern music. We'll get onto that in a minute. That is basically tying things to the grid. Right? The time-based grid, to lock those in. And the spatial-based grid, you know, lock that pitch in, it's out of tune, let's just notch it in tune, it's out of time, let's just notch it in time. Now it's perfect. The perfection represents something. What it represents is perfection. But too much of that, too much towards that perfectionism. You know, these people who don't know what they're doing and they sit there just robotically moving every single vocal into time and tuning every single vocal in, you know, into tune, right? But what they are doing is they are shifting the pendulum away from emotionalism towards perfectionism, right? That pendulum is continually swinging culturally. So my argument is this, is in the late 60s, humanity did not need the drawing in, right? There was something that was really important happening in the 1960s. There was a cultural shift that occurred. And I believe progressive rock was the natural, logical outcome of that. And it was actually the process of moving from expressionism to perfectionism. And I think what we have in the 60s is a generation that of teenagers, so young people who are looking forward into the future, but have in the West the spending power, the free time because of technological advancements that have come through in the modernist era, that they can question for the first time what they want to do. And I think the whole industrial explosion that brings about modernism is all about taking human beings and dropping them onto the grid of perfectionism. It's taking the person working on the farm and going out and their day of looking after the crops or the animals. It's about placing them into a factory, and then that factory having a process, and that person becoming a cog in the machine. And that process, the sort of Western capitalist process, enables people to carve out leisure time. And the leisure time becomes important. Art then is able to drop down from the elite into the masses. And this is something that happens in the 20th century. Plus we have the fact that technology, Western capitalism has created a technology which is able to bring music into everybody's home because of recordings. That's the music industry. So you have to step right out there. You see the music industry emerging. And when teenagers emerge, and teenagers at that point are able to go, I don't want to be the cog in the machine. I have at this point in time, through the sort of fruits of Western capitalism, the free time and the money to choose what I want to do to some extent, or at least some teenagers are allowed to think like that. And they look for a music form which is all about individual expression. It's not about being a cog in the machine. It's about individual expression. And that visceral aspect of rock and roll is about individual expression. And what I mean by that is you do not have to be an elite concert pianist now to express yourself. You know, people are looking at Chuck Berry, they're looking at Fats Domino, Elvis Presley, and they're seeing those three chords and they're hearing the truth and they want a part of it. They're hearing people from other walks of life, and in many cases the blues and jazz, they're hearing musicians that aren't from the privileged elite, and they're singing about things that the privileged elite find abhorrent, right? This is what rock and roll is. We know what the word rock and roll is a euphemism for, don't we? And if you don't, go and look it up. We know what the word jazz is a euphemism for, if you don't go and look it up. This visceral quality, so the pendulum swings to a guttural, visceral form. And this is something that has worth. Now, the music critics love this. They love this visceral thing, and any group that has that, they will champion it. But the trouble is, there have always been elites. It was elites that championed the likes of Robert Johnson and Big Bill Broonzy. It was elites that championed Billie Holiday. I mean, actual elites, you know. And rock and roll is going to get such a boost from a middle class white, you know, musician, Bob Dylan, going out and searching out the truth from this alternative thing. It's all about authenticity. I don't like this idea because I don't think this music is authentic. But there's this idea of authenticity which goes with emotionalism, being able to express yourself simply. Right? Nobody would say this of classical music because classical music is an elite music. It has emotionalism and the grid just wound in right from day one. That's all been done. But with rock music, the pendulum swinging, and 1950s teenagers, they want a bit of that. You know, so the likes of the Beatles are these teenagers that have grown up on skiffle and rock and roll, Leadbelly and, you know, Chuck Berry and all the berries, you know. Berry, I don't know. They take those ideas, but the thing is, there's an idea as well that emerges with rock music, because this is what we're really talking about, the history of rock and roll now and rock music. There's an idea of we need to open ourselves up to other voices. We can't just have the elite. This is about individual expression. This is really important. It's about an individual expression. So what do you think? You know, you're black, what do you think? You're gay, what do you think? You're a woman, what do you think? You're disabled, what do you think? You're Jewish, what do you think? There's this opening up, and all the voices are allowed to come in, and they're allowed to mingle. And in the 1960s, as things like censorship diminishes, in the UK, we decide that we're not going to ban Lady Chatterley's Lover. In 1962 seems the watershed. We open ourselves up to stuff. And in that, the music, because of all these influences, starts to become more sophisticated. Rock and roll turns into rock music. And rock music, because of people like Bob Dylan, can now express much more higher art forms. It's becoming more sophisticated. The grid is starting to emerge. It's like reaching out for the berry. That tastes nice. Oh my God, that one drops you dead. Now we know the berries. They're the nice berries. They're not. What can you do with these berries? Can we cook anything with them? Can we make some jam? And they start jamming. And they come up with all these ideas in the 60s. is this explosion of ideas, all these different music forms. If you listen to rock and roll in 61, 62, and then just fast forward to say 1966 and put a nice album on, you know, or 67 and put a Soft Machine album on, or 68, 69, just put a Hendrix album or King Crimson album. In that time period, music just goes through this absolute shock of what is going on. What we're seeing is the pendulum is balancing it. We're getting a balance between high art forms and low art forms. We're getting a balance between perfectionism and hedonism. The emotionalism's still there, but it's being nailed to a very interesting grid. It's being expanded on. Now, my argument for what progressive rock is, you have rock and roll, this visceral rock and roll. That's AC/DC, that's Chuck Berry, that's the Ramones, that's the Sex Pistols. It's this visceral rock and roll expression. And it's right over on the hedonism side, right? You have that, right? If you take that then and you go, right, what can we do with this? Let's start to expand it out. Let's go and expand it out against the horizon of what the limits of that is. As soon as you start to progress that, I nearly used the word without knowing it, that pushing the limit, that is what progressive is. You can have progressive jazz, progressive funk, progressive house. It's a pushing of the limit. It's that sense of progress. And what the progress does is the expansion into the perfect realm. So if you look at the music that, say, Little Richard's making, we know this is made in the moment. It's visceral. By the time Yes are making Close to the Edge, this has been stitched together in the studio. It's being considered. You know, all those stories of Yes with all those bits of tape hanging on the wall as Eddie Offer tries to cut together these sections to create this grand structure. What we have with progressive rock is a moving over from a hedonism to perfectionism. Now, Yes, and I don't mean the band there, I mean the affirmative word. By the mid-70s, prog has moved too far over to the perfectionism, without a doubt, right? But what it's done in doing that, it has established certain aesthetic ideas that are so valuable and are contained within progressive rock. And these ideas then go into mainstream music and underpin all the music that we like. And this is where I get onto the juice of what makes progressive rock great. And it's my definition. It's the definition of what progressive rock is. And what it is it's the things that were pioneered by these progressive rock bands, which would be, starting off is the Beatles, Cream, Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, Soft Machine, King Crimson, Yes, Gentle Giant, Genesis, Can, Faust, Magma, Focus, all these bands that are all doing all these, you know, Pink Floyd, you know, I could keep going on and on. They're all doing actually different things. And this is one of the problems with the perfectionist progressive rock gatekeepers, is they start to draw lines. I've got people on this channel that will tell me that Pink Floyd aren't a progressive rock band. You know why? Because they have developed a very perfectionist, you know, the pendulum swung all the way over for them, and they know what prog is, and it's the defined thing, and it has to do this, this, and this. And do Pink Floyd really do that? You know, well, do they really do that? I'm not sure. You know, where's the instrumental virtuosity? That's a really important thing. Is it? Is instrumental virtuosity a thing that prog pioneered that is unique to that genre? No, it's not. What it is the opening up of rock music to classical influences, and it's classical virtuosity that brings itself in. That comes from classical music. But what is unique to rock music is rock music's mixed with classical arrangement and instrumental technique. So there we have a first criteria, which I think is the case. And rock opens it up to other forms of music. Jazz improvisation, right? Classical structuring and arrangement. Those are two things that are really particular to prog. Jazz improvisation plays a massively important part in the history of prog, right? Those two things hold hands. Jazz fusion and prog are holding hands in the early 70s, and most jazz fusion bands like the Mavish Introduction, Returns for the Weather Report could easily be described as progressive in the early 70s, before the pendulum swings so far over that the gatekeepers come in and start to nail that thing. What are the aspects that make progressive rock? So yes, the use of different genre, and progressive rock can have any genre come in. You can use anything in progressive rock. It's not a genre that's defined by the sound of that genre. It is possible to make a reggae record and it's a progressive rock album. You can use whatever influences you want. It's the way they are stitched together that makes it progressive rock. But the two overriding important ones is, at the top of the list, classical music forms and jazz improvisation or improvisation. Those are two things. Another thing is the application of technology. So progressive rock, when it was a pioneering form, was taking the instrumental technology of electric guitars, synthesizers, effects pedals, but also studio technology, and that became integral to the making of that music. And we can think of an example of that being Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, or Tubular Bells, by Mike Oldfield. Tubular Bells cannot exist unless there's that technology is in place, right? It's the shifting of the subject matter away from teenage songs about love and the material aspects of being a teenager, driving around in cars and meeting people, and not wanting to go to school, and all those things that are the subject matter of pop music, and are still the subject matter of pop music. There is a shifting away. You could sing about other stuff, but you're really going to often pull from a fantasy or science fiction or sort of romantic poetry, English literate sort of tradition for your subject matter. That's really important for progressive rock as well. You are going to apply a thing which I call the English aesthetic, and I've spoken about on this channel, and I am going to do a video on the English aesthetic. But the English aesthetic is something that is actually wound into the development of rock music. It's there with the Beatles, it's there with the Rolling Stones, it's in all the British bands that really take American forms, music, R&B, jazz, soul, and twist them through a thing I call the English aesthetic. And the English aesthetic for me is a balancing of perfection and of hedonism, but it's a way of balancing a sort of an aesthetic that comes from, I think, the English countryside, which is a very simplistic way of applied to sort of the English class system. And it's a way of pricking the pomposity that existed in the English class system. So here in the UK, we have this incredible class system that goes right up to the King. King Charles is right at the top. There's this huge class system. And rock and roll's actually come in and debunked that. But it's been debunked by using mechanism that exists within the English aesthetic. It's a way of pin-pricking pomposity. That's what the English aesthetic is. It's the aesthetic of the English countryside. It's in romantic poetry. It's the realization of who we are by confronting nature, but that transported through a sort of musical view of the world. The laughing policeman, the way that we bring down the authority. And I need a whole video to explain this, but this sort of creates a sort of almost like the perfectionism, British perfectionism is tempered by an almost do-it-yourself garden shed approach to perfectionism. I think we see ourselves as a nation of creatives working out of garden sheds. We celebrate that so much, and that is wound in. The Beatles are the biggest band in the world. They've got the whole record company behind them, but you don't feel like that when you put an album. What you feel is we have 4 eccentrics making this weird little thing out of their own eccentric doings. This is a really important thing in the English aesthetic, and I think that's wound into the English progressive rock bands, and that spreads out. So you could have these aspects, Rush have the English aesthetic in there. Utopia have the English aesthetic. Kansas have the English aesthetic. And I think to some extent Focus do, although, you know, as I've argued elsewhere, when these bands just for me don't do it as well, you know. But it's in there. It is in there anyway. So that's another aspect that's in there. So all these things I've just described are the things that are pioneered by progressive rock. Now, yeah, the pendulum swings, but the problem is the pendulum swings for progressive rock at a point where music criticism is developing, and there's currency for those critics to suddenly turn around and start championing punk in the 70s and start to put down all these bands which before they had been championing. But all art forms swing from hedonism to perfection. All of them go from this sort of visceral hedonistic beginning to an over perfectionist, overwrought end. That's what happens to absolutely everything. You know, it happened to jazz, it happened to fusion, it happened, you know, it's happened to popular music recently. I think we're in a stage where popular music has just reached the nadir of perfectionism. You know, where everything is just so. There's brilliant songwriting going on, but the songwriting has had to actually simplify itself. This is a point that's never been made. All the Rick Beatos have never made this point. The reason why the music is so simple is because when you start locking stuff to the grid, in the end, you go to just the one. That's where you end up. If we think of chaos as being the infinite and perfection as being the one, you simplify things, you simplify them down, you simplify the notes down, you simplify the chords down, you think like the timing down, everything gets pulled down to this point. You know. It can't go any further. You know, the producers are using computers to just push perfectionism just too far in popular music at the moment. And it happened with prog in the 70s. It became too overblown. It became within the confines. When we listen to it back now, because it was made by real musicians and real studios, when you put on some of those later progressive rock albums, compared to stuff that's being made now, it seems extremely visceral. Because our viewpoint, this is the whole thing about culture. You know, what we need now is different to what was required then. Right, in the 70s, there was a requirement to pull all these things in. But my argument is what punk did is it didn't go against these things. What it did was pull it in, right? And all those punk bands had got prog in their DNA. And we can see with every single one that John Lydon, and then with Public Image Limited, he then is creating a progressive punk band. You know, the Damned have spoken out elsewhere. By 1980, they were making 20-minute long tracks. You know, the Stranglers were a punk band. Susie the Banshees are dripping with punkness. You know, the Clash take that sort of visceral rock and roll thing and they become conceptual with it. But the thing is, yes, they're not making close to the edge because they pulled it in. But how many of those elements are retained that I just went through? Right. They're playing rock and roll, but with the blues taken out. That's the influence of prog, because that's what prog did. A lot of those early prog bands like Jethro Tull and Pink Floyd and Gentle Giant, they started off as blues groups, but they questioned the validity of that. How can you play the blues when you're a British, you know, person? And so they draw it in. The Sex Pistols are playing rock and roll, but they're playing it drawn in with the blues bits taken out. That comes from prog. That's the influence of this stuff coming in. Does it have the moving away from normal pop song lyrics? Yes, of course it does. And when John Lydon says the line "England's dreaming," you know, in God Save the Queen, that is dripping with progressive rockness, I'm afraid. You know, they're exploring technology, but they're exploring technology in a do-it-yourself, you know, way. The aesthetic that brought in the early prog bands is there in bucket loads in punk. So I think that what punk pioneers is a drawing in of all these things that progressive rock has pioneered, and then punk doesn't last very long, and then it allows those things that I've mentioned to then go shooting out into pop music. And we then hear it in The Police, and we hear it in, Joy Division and ABC and Frankie Goes to Hollywood. It's just dripping with prog. All this stuff's dripping with prog. And all the prog musicians that understand how to draw it in, like the Peter Gabriels and the King Crimsons and the Kate Bushes and the Genesises and the Yes, have the biggest success of their career because their stuff in the 80s, in the aftermath of these things being drawn in, had huge success, which then infiltrates into absolutely everything. The things I've described that progressive rock deal with are integrated in absolutely every aspect of music. So if you have a rapper like Kendrick Lamar, who has come through that whole gangster rap thing, and he sits there about to make an album, and he wants to make a career-defining album, how does he take that visceral rap thing that he's doing and extend it out? All he can do is extend it out using the methods and techniques defined by progressive rock. And To Pimp a Butterfly, he makes a progressive rock album that does all the things I've just described. Progressive rock is great because, in terms of popular music, progressive rock has solved the problem of how to take the visceral aspects of pop music, which is inherently fantastic emotionally, but is dumb, and it has shown the world how to expand that out into great art. Okay? And great art is always in the middle ground. The Beatles start off as a rock and roll band. They're a good rock and roll band playing cover versions of their rock and roll songs. Then this aspect starts to develop. They're at their creative peak on Revolver and Sgt. Pepper and Rubber Soul, where these things are in perfect balance. And right up to Abbey Road, it's sophistication with that visceral rock and roll thing matched together. Well, there's a way of doing that musically. There's a way of using technology, of using the studio, of using the voice, the subject matter, of using conceptual continuity, which is another thing I didn't mention as an aspect, where the album became very important. So people started to stick together this idea of conceptual continuity, where the whole album is about one thing. And then we have the concept album on top of that, All these things are what progressive rock has given to the world. And because progressive rock was the nuclear reactor where those ideas were developed in terms of popular music, the albums that exist in that sweet spot between 69 and 75, 76, those albums are masterpieces. And there's many of them. And the reason why I do this channel and champion this music is because I want those albums to be as valued as your Pet Sounds, as your God Save the Queens, And I know they're not. I know that people in the know, especially musicians, if you meet a musician, any musician, and you start to talk to them, of course, we all know these albums. This is the training ground that we grew up in. But out in the wider world, there is this idea that I have tried to elaborate on in this video. I do think that idea is slowly going away. I do think there is a possibility that some young people are finding their way to the brilliance of this music. I think the success of Kate Bush recently shows that there's millions and millions, like virtually the whole population of Earth, when confronted with something which is a little bit more difficult, a little bit more conceptual, pushing the boundaries, they respond to it. Because humans aren't dumb. That's why we're here. Anyway, that has been my video. I think I've come to the end of why progressive rock is good. Right, on the next video, which is going to be far more exciting, and I've set myself up, and no one can have a go at me when I start to get my dagger and put it in to the heart of progressive rock, which I'm about to do on the next video. You can look at this and see how much I absolutely think that this is one of the highest music forms, and it's equal with anything. It's equal with the Miles Davises and the Duke Ellingtons. It's equal with your Bachs and your Beethovens. It really is. I really believe it is. And for me personally, this is the best of progressive rock. Moves me more than anything. It moves me more than all my favourite jazz artists. I have to be honest. Anyway. I can keep talking about this, and I know I've got to stop at a certain point, and I think this is the point where I'm going to stop. So if you like this video, this rambling on about progressive rock, and I have got onto some very esoteric and deep philosophical stuff on this video, because I haven't for a while on this channel. I thought I should have. So I've put prog in the title, so hopefully people will watch it. Usually these videos don't do so well when I get all esoteric, but you might have got duped into it, but I hope you liked being duped, and I hope you liked the chat. I'm going to go now. If you did like it right now. If you want to hear some more, then subscribe. If you want to hear what I'm doing in the next video, ring the notification bell. And I have a Patreon, and if you join the Patreon, there's a whole ton of stuff there. There's loads of videos of me talking about all sorts of stuff, plus my music and chat and all sorts of things going on. So become a Patreon, and I will see you on the next video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon. Bye.